Good afternoon. Welcome, participants. My name is Alejandra Barraza, President of HighScope Educational Research Foundation. Welcome to our sixth roundtable conversation of the book, Don't Look Away. HighScope wants to continue to bring important topics affecting the early childhood field to the focus of educators and policymakers in the United States and across the world. We are happy to close off our roundtable with our sixth roundtable with Keeping the Vision Alive, a final discussion and question and answer with the authors of the book, Don't Look Away, Embracing Anti-Bias Classrooms. And we want to remind everyone and all our participants that the recorded sessions from the roundtable 1 through 5 can be found in the HighScope website, and we will make sure to include it in the chat. We also want to remind everyone that the book, Don't Look Away, Embracing Anti-Bias Classrooms, is available to you in the highscope.org shopping cart. We are very excited to welcome also the chair of our board of directors, Jana Martella, who will serve as our moderator for our sixth roundtable. Welcome, Jana.
Thank you, Ali, and welcome to all of the folks in the audience. I'm sure, like me, you're enthused to hear from the folks that we see here on this slide. They're very familiar to us, have led a discussion over the course of the last 7 months or so. I'm not going to tell you the institutions where Ioma, Stephanie, and Tanya are professors, are researchers, are teacher educators. You can read that there. And we will be holding them up in conversation in just a few minutes. I will remind you, though, that each of them also has young children. And I told Dr. Durden earlier that should her children kind of flit across the screen, that would be a reminder to us that you are in this work with that perspective as well. I also am really delighted to include Brian Stokes with me in the conversation. Brian has been on the HighScope Board of Directors the last 4 years or so, and comes at the discussion from the vantage point of managing a very large program that many of you may be familiar with, the Chicago Public Schools Early Childhood Program. And Brian will also be responding to the authors. So with further ado, I'd like all of the panelists, if you would, to turn on your microphones and your videos, and we will kind of join in conversation. And I'll actually start with a question myself, and that is, I've seen many of you in Zoom meetings, and in fact, yesterday joined Ioma in a Zoom meeting with state early childhood policy makers. So I'd like to kind of start by just asking you, on average, how often have you been delivering kind of information like this in the netherworld of Zoom? You can each answer, or one of you can answer.
Well, I'll jump on really briefly. Actually, I had a session that I did at a university this morning with administrators focused on racial trauma in the workforce, in the workplace. And so what's interesting is that this topic in our book with anti-bias, education, cultural relevancy, is also applicable, to adults, to faculty, to staff and institutions as well. So racism and bias really does permeate. It doesn't have an age. And so there was a lot of things in our book that I could directly apply to professionals and researchers who are doing this anti-bias work that are experiencing these things as well in their workplace. And so that was a very recent but different type of example of how this work is transcending to all different, areas and fields and individuals.
Thank you, Tanya.
I'll just say hello, everybody. It's nice to see you, Jana. And of course, Ali, thank you for allowing us to enter your space. And thank you to all of the attendees who I think have been on this journey with us since I think the first webinar last year. It feels like time is just time. And I think, right, to your question, so thank you for joining me yesterday. I feel like I have webinars every single day, which I think is really my answer to your question. Right. I think, as sad as COVID has been, and it still is, because we're still in a pandemic, even though some people think we're not, I will say my world has been, I feel like I'm definitely in webinars, either as a participant or as part of the panel or whatever it may be, really I would say probably almost every week. I think there's not a week that doesn't go by where I'm not sort of either leading talking about that. And I think it speaks to what people have been asking for. And so I think, we have been lucky to have a platform to do that, and a way to do that and really share with so many people who we would not have under a different circumstance. So thank you all for providing the space for us to kind of engage in this last conversation in the series.
And the only thing that I would add to it is that, yes, I'm doing a lot of webinars as well, but I also want to just remind everyone that this is also part of our teaching. So, I know I'm teaching classes, and so I've been talking about these ideas and these topics with my students for years and years, and I continue to do that in all of my classes as well. So we're talking about this every day.
Yes, and the world and the country is a better place because of it, I would have to say. So, it's been more than a year since you published Don't Look Away. And it's been a remarkable year at that, one that I'm sure you couldn't conceive of the depth of need that the book actually addressed. I'd like you each to kind of share a reflection of the journey that you've taken this last year, kind of major milestones that either this book or your work. Stephanie, thank you for again reminding us that you're a teacher educators as well. But from this book, the milestones of this last year, and I will dig in a little deeper on some of the things that I know about your research and about some of the projects that you've been engaged in. Tanya, let's start with you. We'll go in backward alpha order. Kind of big milestones. They can be personal milestones as well, because I do think this is a personal effort. Person role system is what we're trying to improve.
Mm-hmm. So when you write a book, you think you know everything, right, about the topic. So, oh yes, I wrote a book. Go Google me, Google everything about what I write about anti-bias education. Well, I would say the biggest milestone is, a big part of the fabric of our work is that we research it, it's our scholarship, but we also live it as well. We're parents, we're mothers, we're other mothers. And so I have as many of you know, a 1-year-old, 3-year-old, and 5-year-old. And so my 5-year-old is a beautiful, amazing Black girl. And so even with this work that we do, I am still learning from her of ways in which to create a positive racial identity. Not too long ago, I texted and emailed the authors and said, help. I sent them a picture of my daughter. It was right after bath time, and she had wrapped a towel around her head. And she said, look, mommy, my long, beautiful hair. And so, we talk about race, we talk about Black girl magic. This is what we do in our home. And of course, my heart just melted. And I said, well, mommy's hair is curly and it's short. And, tell me a little bit about that. Who is it that has, long hair? And so she says, Rapunzel and Beyonce. And so, of course, I'm like in tears as a mother and a scholar, and I'm emailing, texting the author saying, what do I do? We write about anti-bias and positive racial identity. And so after they calmed me down, I remember particularly Stephanie say, you know what, there's a racialized, she included Beyonce. But do some additional things, show her all of the different, beauty and ways, as women and as Black women, we represent and present ourselves in the world, and just hang in there, stand firm. So I get constant reminders, not only from my own children, but also the teachers that I work with, that this work is ongoing. And even those of us who may be doing this work every day and think that we're being effective in the implementation and support of positive racial identity of young children, is still more work that has to be done and to not get discouraged.
Thank you. Stephanie, you're next down the alphabet.
So I would say some of the lessons, I've learned lessons for work, and I've also learned lessons for my personal life. I also have two children, an 11-year-old and an 8-year-old. And what I have learned from them is just about the resilience of children and their beauty and sort of their hope and way of seeing the world. So, you know, my children have been exposed to more negative, all of our children have been exposed to more negative racial violence than ever before, than they have ever been before. It's all over the TV. You can't hide it from them. And I was really worried about my young children, you know, being afraid and developing sort of negative feelings towards others, towards other groups. And I'm just amazed at the way in which my children have, you know, of course, through our guidance and talking with them, have been able to sort of solidify their racial identity even more, but to still embody that racial identity in a positive way, and to still think about their friends and other people that, you know, we're connected to who are not Black, who are not African American, and still have positive relationships with them and still really see them as good and kind. And I was, you know, almost brought to tears the other day when I was in the car with my son, and he said something about, we were talking about general things like police officers. We saw a police car while we were driving on the road, and he said something about, well, you know, well, police officers are nice. And I was kind of, wow, taken aback, because at this point I had not expected him to still have that idea, but he does, even though he knows what has gone on. So I'm just amazed at the way, even at their young age, they're able to differentiate, you know, and not just not think about things, you know, just so sort of dichotomously, like it's good or it's bad. They're actually able to really understand sort of what has happened and the nuance of what has happened, and allow that negativity by certain people to not shape their view of an entire group of people. And I'm just so pleased and relieved about that.
Thank you. Children, even the very youngest children, it seems sometimes bring wisdom to the world that we don't give them credit for. And so we have to offer them the experience and the opportunity to express that. I see you're nodding your head there. So I know you have something to add here.
Yeah, I'll just add, I mean, it's just, even though, I've known Tanya and Stephanie for many years, it's always such a joy just to kind of obviously continue to be part of their world, and just to sort of just get that strength from even their words. And so I just have three things that I will point out that I think some of the big things is the mommy guilt. I feel like in many ways, right, this sort of world has helped me to say, you know what, I gotta shed that, right? That I think is beautiful for my kids. I have a 4 and 8-year-old, for them to see kind of what I say, what I think, this is a thing they would never have gotten to see, right? So they get to really see what mommy does in some ways. And I think that's something really important and valuable. And I'm hoping to the educators that are out there is to see that there's a lot that our children have learned, that they don't need to be, you don't have to go fill them up. It's been empty for the past year and a half. But I think it's to see what they've been exposed to in all the different ways. Then the second thing I would say is that, husbands and fathers, I think we've been lucky, right? We're mothers and we're women, Black faculty women, et cetera. But also I feel like what it made me see is also the value of my husband, but also the value of fathers, right? Because I feel like because I have been on the screen for so long, right? It's so much, 80 hours a week sometimes, right? And that means that somebody has to take care of the kids. And that means that their dad has and has always been, but even more so, has been really the person who takes care of them, heals them, all those things. And so in many ways, I feel like part of my own, I think, full of vision is the contribution of my husband, but the contribution of fathers and males writ large. And I think it's also that we have to continue to figure out how do we make sure that Black men and fathers are not made invisible, that we also show that they are also educators, that, obviously we have Brian, nice to see you, that we have to make sure that we don't sort of ignore the fact of the value of men. And then my last point is really around sort of like the kids, and especially my kids, is that I some of this work is sometimes really hard, right? It's really also very personal, but the beauty of sort of at least the having kids in many ways, or is that when they come and say, I still love you, like my 4-year-old is like, I still love you, which means I must have did something wrong, right? That, just those words, is just that it means so much and it fills you up. And so I do think we need to continue to notice that our kids are still trying to be kids. And I hope that educators and those who take care of our kids remember that they are kids. They're 40-month-olds, they're 60-month-olds, they're 82-month-olds. They really still are kids, and to not treat them as adults who should know better. So for me, that's something I still have to work on, and the journey I'm on. And then finally, I feel like I'm still on a journey of discovery. There's a lot of U.S. history that I don't know. I have to unlearn some things and learn better. And I think hopefully the next books we write will have even more of the richness of history and what does that mean for early care education. So again, I so much I'm learning, and I love that I'm learning for also people who are out there teaching me about more that I can do and more that I can learn. So thank you.
I love that. And Ioma, yesterday you described how important kind of you as researchers, certainly knowing the information about the children in order to make sound policy decisions, but also the experiences the children are having, and how great that you're kind of describing the experience that your own children are having and how important that is in the mix that you're learning from as researchers. I love also dishing in the idea, because I've learned so much from all of you over the course of the last 6 webinars. And it's not that quality and equity are new subjects to me, but my eyes have become widened to my own personal history, the history of our country, like you highlight, et cetera. I also think you gave us a perfect segue to ask Brian. Brian, I'm so delighted you're here. As a male, it is a rarity in the early childhood field, and you have been a leader at the state level, at the national level, now at the district level, certainly in early childhood. I'm sure you have some questions for your colleagues or some thoughts on what they've said so far.
Yeah, I don't think I have questions. I was like listening along. I'm like, oh, I'm really enjoying this. I'm like, oh, I just have a question. Well, so I will for the next time. But no, I mean, lots of thoughts. I actually, when you were asking about, how much time we've all spent on, on Zoom, and I feel like it's just been infinite. But I've had a few times, I started my current job during the pandemic, so like a year and 2 months ago. And so I've had some time recently to actually visit some of our classrooms. And Ioma, what you said about despite everything that we're worried about, that kids are still learning, and we do focus on what kids are learning and the experiences they're having, even though we think that due to the pandemic that sort of learning stopped, or that there's just nothing but trauma. I've a few things that stand out. I had a chance to visit one of our classrooms a few months ago. And, for the end of the year, we were in sort of this hybrid learning of kids learning virtually and kids learning in the classroom. And I got to see, recording of, a teacher had created this experience using, I think, Google Jamboard. And so, this little girl missed her friends. She was learning remotely. Her friends were in the classroom. And the teacher had things set up where the kids could see each other. And so the teacher created an experience where the little girl and her dad created in this Google Jamboard a story about the little girl and her friends that they acted out with little pictures for her friends in the classroom. And it's like, wow, what a creative thing that this kid came up with, and what, you know, what this an experience that wouldn't have happened. That you know, the wondering I had, maybe this is a question, is sort of like, what is it, despite all of the you know, all the loss and the challenges of the past year, and I heard a lot of learning, and what I wonder is like, what is it that we should be, what is it we should be carrying with us into, you know, hopefully we're getting post-pandemic sometime soon here, but, you know, into the future, what is it we've learned, or what is it that's worked well that we should be carrying with us and keeping with us?
That's a great question, Brian. Then I think about that a lot, right? Because I think there is a lot, right? Like when I think about like on the policy side, it was a lot that was done in terms of getting cash to families, getting cash to providers. So there's a lot of things that I think on the policy side, when I think about what are the things that we should take away. One is that teachers were creative, right? So imagine, right? You learned a particular way. This is how you teach a class. You come in and do all this, but now you have to literally go and do a whole rewind, retake on how do you teach through, you know, a Zoom or Google Hangout. How do you actually do hybrid? That wasn't even in the lexicon, right? And that was the only hybrid I knew was the QRIS, right? That was the hybrid stuff we were talking about. So imagine that the skill that teachers have to be flexible. So I think that's one. The second thing I hope that we do take away is the family piece, right? Because I think if you remember, you could not get a child on a Zoom, on a Google or whatever, without having to at least make sure that the families were there, somebody was there, right? And that meant that you had to kind of connect with families in a different way, in a better way, hopefully. So I do hope we take away some of that notion that early kid education is that your job is not to go and take kids and fix kids. Your job is to be part of the larger fabric of children's sort of ecosystem. And so I do hope that we really begin to me, what I would say is early childhood has continued to center families as sort of the core of the work that we do. And of course, the children are there in your classroom, your program, but we have to still center families and their voices in a really, really clear, authentic way, which is not how we started. So I do think I hope we take some of that. And then, of course, I would say the kids. I hope, because you couldn't test the kids. That was the thing I liked about it. You couldn't test the kid. And so I even though some people, you know, tried, you know, some of us educator people tried. But you in a way, we have to figure out how we assess whether a child was learning in different ways. So again, it's almost like the innovation that was happening. So I hope that some of that spirit of innovation, relaxing some of the policies, whether it's around testing, assessment, all these things was somewhat relaxed. And I think in many ways allowed us to show who we truly are, at least as a system. So I do hope some of that kind of comes, and I'm talking to you, Brian, because you know you run a whole district. So so I hope there are some things that you all could to take away and to make the job of educators easier, especially when they have been under stress, have been dealing with secondary and primary trauma. And when there's still in many instances, you know, not in Chicago's, you know, public school, but in other sort of community-based programs are still underfunded and underpaid. So I would say if we can take some of that and then get money to the teachers, and then you can do whatever else you want.
Do you want others to go?
Yes, Stephanie, go.
Okay, so I would say I echo the idea that I hope that we move forward really remembering sort of, like she said, the innovation of the teachers and the creativity and just what I believe to be heroes teachers were to come to the plate. And I just really believe that through this whole ordeal, teachers were the unsung heroes, teachers from early childhood and all the way up to K through 12, because they showed up even though they were afraid for their own lives, for their families' lives, and they were creative and innovative. So I hope that we keep that in our mind at the forefront. I also hope that we keep in mind the focus on children's social and emotional development, because I felt like during the beginning of this, we were talking a lot about the social and emotional development and health of children, about their peer connections, about their emotional development, about sort of just their social skills. All of that in general was paramount to us in the beginning of this pandemic. It's only lately, you know, like in the last towards the half a year to, you know, or so, that we really started to get so nervous about like, oh my goodness, what about the learning loss? Oh my goodness, what about this and what about that? And I'm just like, I really hope that we move beyond that and understand that development is more holistic than that, and that the emotional health of children is more important to me than any sort of academic content that they may or may not be learning, or that they may or may not need more time now in the future to learn. That is okay. We can adjust the academic things, but we can't make up for sort of any hurt, any emotional sort of things that we neglect to give children sort of in this time and in this space. So I hope we keep that at the forefront. And I had one other thing that I was going to say. I can't remember it now. Maybe it'll come back to me after Tanya's done. Go ahead.
No problem. I would just add, I'm a qualitative researcher. So I think that this is a great opportunity to collect lots of stories and data that contributes to our tool bag of what culturally responsive education looks like. Because families and caregivers and those who have taken care of these children over the past year have lots of stories, across the domains of how to apply, the development and skills that children, and someone included in the chat box, that children are always learning. They have continued to learn. And so we have lots of rich stories that we can learn from families and caregivers and from the community of ways in which children have demonstrated their skills, their knowledge, and their competencies. And that's what culturally relevant teaching is. And that's what we were also emphasizing in our book. And I also want to echo what Ioma mentioned about centering families, and also what we've learned in our own regards as professionals. I know as a parent of little ones, I learned, talking about fathers, I learned that my father, their grandpa, because he was a part of the village that took care of them, is really good at hide and seek. And so it's one of those really fascinating type of wonders, and engagement in the relationships that children now had with, adults and primary caregivers they may not have interacted with on a daily basis before. And so that is wonderful, and that's essential, and we can build upon that. And then lastly, I want us to emphasize not to forget the early childhood educators, the programs that did not survive, where the COVID really did force them to close and force them out of our workforce. We need to welcome them back, encourage them back, and support them back into our early childhood workforce and community.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Stephanie, if you remember anytime throughout the next 45 minutes, feel free to.
No. That's why I roll with them. She said it. That was the last point. That's what I was remembering. Thank you.
Yes.
While we roll.
That is so awesome. I also loved the idea that the San Antonio teachers reminded us of, that Zoom actually gave the children and the parents of the children an opportunity to come into the home of the teacher. Which is a new venue, right? So there are some strengths that happened as a result of this, and some things that we're learning. And thank you all researchers for putting this into practice. I do want to ask one question that I've already seen in the chat, and that is, throughout the course of thinking about Don't Look Away, have you been into classrooms where you learn something new to kind of, that has addressed some of the things that you wanted to address in your book?
So I have not had an opportunity to be in any classrooms throughout the pandemic, but we have had more time to watch more videos of people interacting in classroom space. So that has helped me sort of understand and think of what is quality care, what is culturally responsive care, what is equity, et cetera. So I haven't been in the classroom in person, but I have witnessed classrooms in the virtual world.
Yeah, sorry, none of us have been in the classroom. It was an interesting question, but I know you have interacted with all of you, with teachers, et cetera. So. One of the things that we asked at the very beginning of this book study was whether, following the completion of Don't Look Away, you realized that you forgot something or you left something off. Now it's 7-8 months later, I'm wondering if we can readdress that question. Have you been, one of the questions in the, I think in the chat or in the Q&A is, it has proven very useful to teachers. So are you planning, or is there any possibility of publishing in other languages?
I think that's completely up to the publisher. The publisher always has the rights to publish in other languages for sure. We should write to the publisher and ask them.
Good answer. So we'll include that to write off to the publisher. So other thoughts, things that have come to mind that you wish you had placed in the book, or that might be the kernel of a next adventure?
Well, I mean, I'll start. I would say there's so much. I mean, it's a short book, right? And that was on purpose. We wanted it to be useful to our early educators, right? Who have, who need, tools, resources, and affordable. So that was really done on purpose with our, as we call our warrior teachers. I mean, at least for me, I feel like there's so much in my head that I hope we get out, right? One is to, I think, continue to push on the journey that, at least for me, I'm on, in terms of, right, there's anti-bias, but then there's actually anti-racist, and then there's really white supremacy, right? So I feel like I think, as in many ways, it's almost like, you have your baby, you become a toddler, and as you grow and you learn, there's more that you yourself are gaining from those around you, and that you now have even more words and voices for. You have more examples, and so I would say, some things will be to really continue to push on that journey, because me, particularly being in North Carolina, being at UNC, and obviously just seeing sort of the sort of, I would say what, MLK talks a lot about, the sort of the white backlash, right? I feel like I'm living it, and maybe all of us in Georgia has, anti, CRT, critical race theory, sort of. So where some of us are living in those spaces, both in our university and in the state that we're in. And that's part of it, right? So it's almost like, in some ways, how do we also, I would say, like to put in the book, right, future books, about how do we sort of push against some of that, right? Because that's just part of growth, is that when you're growing and you're seeing things, right, you think everything will go forward at the same time, but we should be ready for the resistance that is likely to happen. And so how do we give tools to those who may have to engage with the resistors and sort of those sort of things? I think for me, that would be sort of the next part of the chapter. And then the other one would be to kind of give case studies. I would love to, having, I think, been on so many different calls and people asking us, what would you do? We're all white city, all white school. What do we do differently? Being able to ask, other, educators and professionals who use the book, from early care education to public health people, a whole bunch of people, like, how did you use this book in your book studies? We had a lot of book studies. Being able to kind of bring some of those sort of people forward to give voice to them, to say, well, how did you use this book? And what did it do for you? And what would you ask us to add or do differently? So being able to kind of make it even more interactive would be sort of, for me, another goal for books, is to do that. And then finally, I would say the last part I would say is being able to speak to leaders. I think, hopefully you provided resources and tools to educators. But in the end of it, many educators are doing their best with marginal support in some instances, but being able to give resources to leaders and leadership to be able to be part of the change. And so for me, part of it is, how do we create tools and resources for leaders to engage in this work? Because without them, it's really hard for educators to do a lot on their own. And so being able to resource and support leaders to do that across many levels, from local to state and national, I think would be really, really helpful, because in the end of it, they are the gatekeepers to change. And I think that we need to be able to push them to sort of even push themselves, and give them the courage to do what may seem hard, but what is necessary for true transformative change.
So thank you, Ioma, and Tanya and Stephanie, you may want to chime in. I'd like to kind of make an action commitment. We've had, over the course of these 6 webinars, an audience that is around 3,000 people, many who are practitioners. So if I can obligate Ingrid, Alejandra, Katie, to the idea of surveying the audience to see what they would find useful in the next, not iteration, we won't obligate you guys to write another book together, but certainly to join hands in developing the tools that are going to help reach the system from top to bottom, from those leaders, Ioma, that you described, down to the teacher assistants that are so important in working through these challenges with our young children. Stephanie, I see you're unmuted.
I was just going to add to this because I love the fact of thinking about our leaders and the tools and sort of strategies that they need to learn. But I think it was someone who asked us at one point throughout the year and a half about for sort of more concrete ideas about what they can do in their classrooms, what books they can use, what activities they can use, how they can sort of make sure that they're doing, that they're engaging in culturally responsive practices. And so I would really love and enjoy to be writing something for teachers that is sort of like a daily kind of like a workbook, like not a workbook, but sort of like something that they can sort of go to get ideas, specific ideas of saying, oh, I'm going to read this book this week. And I know that this book is about this topic. And I might ask this question and set up the room this kind of way, you know, et cetera. I would just, I get excited about that because my dream job in the world is to be a preschool teacher. So I would just love to be doing that stuff. It gets me close to the classroom. It's my dream job.
That's so delightful. I got some preschoolers, Stephanie. You want to go? You want me to give you my preschoolers? I love it. I didn't want to cut you off. I was going to add on, but I didn't want to cut you off, Stephanie or Jana.
Go ahead.
Well, the only thing that I want to add is this work, and you know, I echo what both of the authors have just mentioned, that makes me really excited. I wish there were more time and, you know, days in the year. But one of the things that I also want to emphasize is I think that it's also important. We did a really good job, I think, talking about or just touching on the surface of how we got to this point where we need anti-bias and anti-racist and culturally relevant education. But I would really like a separate kind of companion piece that really dives deep into looking at our history, kind of what, you know, Ian mentioned a little bit earlier, our history, but then how that leads to what is truly anti-bias education and a social political construct of culturally relevant teaching, how we then do that inside of the classroom, and how it's been done starting in the 80s when this concept was even developed, and how it can be done now in 2021 or beyond. And so I really think it's important to make that historical connection of how we have transformed, how we have made lots of gains in civil rights and liberties, but how we have a very long way to go. And then how we teach children very explicitly using very explicit historical and present day examples, how to teach in an anti-bias way. So that's the first piece. And then the second piece, I think we need some kind of strategy, companion piece, series focused on caregiver wellness and resiliency. This work is tough work. This work is traumatic work. It is exhausting. Whether you are a Black and brown person who lives this and experiences and actually does research with it, or also our champion from other ethnicities as well that's doing this work, especially in this time when if you even know the word critical race theory, then you're being blacklisted. And so I think it's important with those who are true advocates and true champions in really doing this anti-bias work to have some type of a space, place, resource of how we can release that energy that connects to us, that can prohibit us from doing good work and having the momentum to continue this work. What that will look like, I don't know, but I think it's very much needed. We have a professor here at Georgia State who's amazing, who just wrote a book about yoga and the role yoga has played with Black women starting in the civil rights. And with reading her book, I didn't realize that Rosa Parks was a huge yoga individual. And that's how she released the racial trauma that she was experiencing from doing this advocacy work. And so I would love to kind of dabble into seeing how we can transfer all this good stuff we give in you to take care of yourself so you can continue. You don't die of high blood pressure because of doing this work.
Thank you. Actually, another rose, pink, kind of highlighted that compassion fatigue is real. I think that that's really true. It kind of, you can add in Zoom fatigue as well, although I'm finding this uplifting, not fatiguing in any way. Brian, you have thoughts or questions?
Yeah, no, I mean, that was fantastic. I think all those thoughts. I think my first thought is, Stephanie, if your dream job is to teach preschool, we're opening, we're moving towards universal preschool in Chicago. So just, let me know when you're ready to come to Chicago and teach preschool. We'll find you a classroom. I would say in that conversation, I heard at least 3 new books I think you guys are writing, right? So one for administrators, one a daily guide for teachers, and one a caregiver guide. But I really do think, I was looking through, my copy right here, looking through the book, again last night, and I really do think I like this idea of like, how do we take these ideas and move them into action? I think especially for leaders, we know that school leaders are so, they've got so many responsibilities that we expect on them, and same for center-based provider leaders, and kind of throughout our system, we expect so much, and we expect such divided attention that giving people really concrete, actionable, kind of steps is so critical. And I heard the same thing, I think, Stephanie, about what teachers need in terms of like, okay, you can't do everything, so here's the thing you can do today. And so I guess my question would be sort of that, like, what would you, thinking about that as being that need, and same for, caregiving, like this need of like, how do you today take care of yourself? If it's yoga or whatever it is, what's the charge that you would give to sort of participants as, a thing they can do tomorrow or next week as a starting point, if you're writing these next 3 books that you're writing?
I would say the first thing that I would say is to take care of yourself, to think about, your health, your sanity, et cetera, and to engage in something that a routine practice that helps you take care of yourself, your physical health and your mental health. I think that's first and foremost, because if our teachers are not strong, and even our parents, if we're not strong and healthy, and then we can't sort of really be there for the younger ones. So that's my first thing that I would say. And I'm going to see if anybody else will jump in.
Say joy, right? So part of one of a dear scholar, a colleague of mine, Dr. Goldie Muhammad, she writes about an element, a identity framework she comes up with that's connected to anti-racist and culturally relevant teaching as joy. How do we create joy for children? And so I would just ask that, how does what you do in this anti-bias work is joyful for you? And focus on that joy. How does it bring you joy? How does it bring you excitement? And to focus on that. And then from there, of course, the self-care, and also to always strive to learn more, to put yourself into insider outsider experiences where you're connecting with, cultural groups and intersectionality of these groups that are similar to your multiple identities and intersectionalities of these identities, and also that are outside of your identities or your cultural group. That's how we grow. That's how we learn how to really make this anti-bias work really meaningful and effective and bring us joy. One of the communities that I have to learn more about is the transgender community, and really learning about how this work applies, anti-bias education really applies to individuals who identify and who are not identify, who are transgender. And so just, figure out ways in which you can continue to grow, to expand, and to find joy in everything that you do.
I agree. I mean, I feel like, Stephen Tyre, I think, said exactly what I put in my notes over here. But I would just add laughter, right? In the end of it, right? And I think that's part of that sort of joy, is that this is hard work, right? And I say all those things, but I really do a terrible job of doing those exact same things, right? Which is really, especially like take care of yourself stuff. I think that's something that I'm working on. So I'm a work in progress. So, caution. But I do think that is important, right? Spending time with loved ones and really getting nurtured, whether spiritually, with family, etc. But I do think just, a couple of sprinkle, if not a lot of laughter, makes a huge difference. And I think that for me, that's part of writing a book, is that you have to love what you're about to write and lean into it, but also know that there has to be some level of joy, even if you're talking about something as hard as sort of, white supremacy and racism, but knowing that in the end of when you're doing it with sort of people who you consider part of your village, part of your community, it does make it easier. So I would say, to me, that's part of it. Find your community, find your village, and really lean into that.
Thank you. I think that that's so important from a policy perspective. I know that you've been engaged with the Children's Equity Project on providing policymakers and leaders some direct recommendations for dismantling racism. We've had a few questions in the Q&A about critical race theory. I feel sometimes that is a heady concept that I can't get my head around. And I love your starting point with your book. And that is, we will not look away from this challenge. We will not, we'll continue to engage in the work without stopping. And I think that, we all have lots to learn. And thank you for those things that you've added to the mix. Brian, I love that you kind of talked about these 3 books that these 3 and 4 authors might pursue. Obviously, everyone at all levels needs the poking and prodding and effort to kind of continue in the work. So we're up to our last 10 minutes before we go to Q&A with our audience. And I wanted to kind of pose again the original question that we asked 6 months or so ago, which is, as you have observed and experienced this last year, remembering actually, Ioma, that the idea of this book study began kind of shortly after you published, but in the throes of an amazing summer last year, a year ago now. So as you've observed and experienced this last year, what in Don't Look Away, and specifically in Don't Look Away, you're all 3 engaged in deeper, more expansive kind of critical research and analysis, but what in Don't Look Away has become more urgent to each of you?
I mean, it's funny you asked that question, actually, because I was actually going to say right before that, while we're Black women, right, you could also see how our interests, our personalities kind of are sort of unique, right, with Stephanie and sort of the sort of want to be a preschool teacher diary, Tanya caregiving, me, the leadership. In many ways, it shows how we try to bring each of our sort of lens expertise. And I would say for me, to that question, to me, the urgency is about the history. I mean, that's because that's, I think, the lens that I particularly have and sort of lean into, is because there's clearly an attempt to whitewash, if I can use that term, the history that we know is there. And I should put a caution note on this, that again, I'm at UNC, the one that basically decided to reject or not tenure one of our premier journalists, Nicole Hannah-Jones, who's best known for the 1619 Project, who was also one of our keynote speakers when I was at High Scope a couple years ago. So an esteemed journalist known, in many ways, I would argue worldwide, but also really told the story, the history of US that I think many people did not know. So for me, the fact that we are trying to sort of, whitewash it or sort of have it be excluded in any kind of educational space is one that I worry about. Because what it means is that we're going to, in many ways, erode all of the progress that Black people and other people of color and white people have helped to move forward. And so for me, when you don't know your history, you're about to repeat it, and the oppression and oppressive system will maintain itself. So I would say that, as much as people, I think, and we're all, happy that we have an administration that is advancing racial equity, the issue is that that's the beginning to a much larger journey. And we need to make sure that we understand the history, that we know about it, and then we teach our children, whether you're a parent, an other parent, an educator, an adult, whoever, because when we lose the history that we have, we're not going to know where we're going to go. We don't know what to stop. This is why structural racism has been with us for so long, because a lot of us had to unlearn faulty narratives, and they're not having to learn it, like myself. So to me, to have to wait a whole 20, 30 years to understand how racism is literally embedded in not just the way our systems work, but even the way we interact with each other, is a danger that we all have to take seriously if we're trying to really do the best for our children. So for me, I think the history and how it manifests itself, and even what we're seeing in early care education, the fact that we have sort of a bifurcated system with many Black women of color who are working, who are subsidizing a system because they're making $11 an hour. When you are making $11 an hour, you are subsidizing the system so the rest of us who are highly educated, got money, could go work and make more money and go on and go to space. Right? That is what we're doing, is actually subsidizing people to be wealthy and rich. That in of itself is a problem. And until we understand that, I feel like we are in very, very challenging times.
Yeah, I thank you also for kind of highlighting earlier on that we can get to, story is a part of history, right? So we can tell those stories, and that it is just that we do so. And that doesn't exclude joy that you talked about earlier. The National Teacher of the Year is a first grade teacher from Nevada, and her pledge for this coming year is that every child would experience a joyful and a just classroom. So Tanya and Stephanie, also, what is urgent for you?
Yama just dropped the whole mic. She dropped 2 mics on that. So I would just add to hers just 2 things. Just one, with that said, comes the tough stuff, right? It comes to racial reckoning. So if we are to agree that Black and brown people, Indigenous people in this country have endured oppression in every institute in our society, and that others have benefited from this oppression, then what are we going to do next? From land being taken away, to educational opportunities, to promotions that have been, they've been excluded from. So we have this period of educational reckoning that we're really going to have to address in early childhood and in our workforce. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing, as it relates to, particularly also with this book, is we talk a lot about this connection. So if we get to the teacher level, what is this connection that we have with children, this authentic connection, this cultural connection, this joy, this interaction? One of the things that I noticed, I have my 1-year-old who's starting group care, and he started a couple of weeks ago, and he's in a culturally relevant child care group facility. But one of the things I just ordered for the teachers, because they follow CDC guidelines and they wear masks, is a faceless mask. Because a part of culturally relevancy is not only for children to know that you have their best intentions, but to feel it and to see it. And a lot of what we do in this anti-bias work is also not what we say, but what we do and our expressions. And so I'm really excited to see, the transformation that I think, will happen with the connection of just my child and his teacher, so that he can actually see her smile. He can see the joy on her face when he walks into the classroom, and what a difference that would make.
There will be a time when we're all maskless out there in the world, but I think that that's really important.
So I'm going to say, I want to start my thing like this, because I thought that the original question was, what is sort of the one thing that we would sort of put to the forefront to be like the most important sort of lesson that we would take away from the book, or where we should move? And I'm going to push back and say that I think that's the wrong question, right? Because this idea of saying, well, what's the one thing we should work on and we should fix? That's oppressive thinking, and that's oppressive problem solving, because I believe, in my opinion, the powers that be would love it for us to say, well, this is the most important thing. You just think about this, and then they can kind of massage things and be like, well, everything else is okay. Right. So if we just focus on this one thing, then all the other stuff, will end up being all right. And I don't agree with that. I think that we have laid out a menu of things that need to be fixed, and that whole menu needs to be addressed in order to have a balanced diet. It's not just, we cannot allow the system to just focus on one thing and sort of get us all dazed and hazed because we're all looking at that one thing. There is a systematic problem with multiple things that are wrong, and we need to keep our eyes on all the multiple problems that are there. So that's what I'll say.
Definitely. I do want to acknowledge, I know that Yom is only with us for a couple more minutes. I want to give Brian an opportunity to ask any additional questions as well before we try to address some of the Q&A there. That's an opening for you, Yoma, to give us any final thoughts as well.
I know, sorry. I mean, I'll have a couple more minutes. They moved the meeting a little bit, just, I know, right? I think that was a really great point. And I think it's actually a good segue, at least a little bit, to what I wanted to make sure to mention, that in one of the reports that I co-author with many other organizations, including the Children's Equity Project, but also in partnership with other national organizations like the National Black Child Development Institute, NAYC, et cetera. We do lay out sort of a blueprint, right, about how do we dismantle racism in early care education. And we didn't list 14, but we know there's like 550. So, right, like the Head Start standards, there's like 550, right? But I think exactly to Stephanie's point is that, you know, racism works in many ways. It's almost like whack-a-mole doll, right? Like you knock one down and trust me, there's a whole 3 others right there. And so that's the idea, is that because it is system, right, you know, structural racism and systemic racism really operates at so many levels and across so many things. And so, for example, in the report, we talk about just even equitable funding, the fact that for a long time and even to today, much of the funding has actually gone to majority white places and white kids, right? It never put that in the law books, but that's actually what happened. But as soon as we try to sort of add language of people of color, Black people, it becomes a whole Supreme Court issue. So how do we create equitable funding? By redressing the past, right? As I think the Biden administration talks about, how do we address those historical issues of where we never provided financial resources and supports to programs, to families, because we create segregation, financial inequitable access to banking, et cetera. So we talk about equitable funding, but we also talk about how do we make sure that we address, you know, wages, but also even our family child care home and our informal and family friend and neighbor care, right? So there's a lot in the system that we can actually do today under our current policies, whether it's under our quality rate improvement systems, whether it's under our Child Care Development Fund grants. So there's a lot of things we can do right now that does not require the act of Congress to go do a whole commission study. And then the last thing I would say too is, and I thought Tanya was gonna actually say this, is the idea of reparations, right? I say that knowing that probably 50% of the audience is going to walk out the door. And the reason I do say that is even within early care education is, again, because early care education just starts with enslaved women who were taking care of, you know, enslavers, children, and families. Those are things that you can't get back. But can you do some reparation, which really means about repair, right? And that means that we're seeing some examples, they're not perfect, whether it's Evanston, Illinois, and Amherst, Massachusetts. We are, even the highway, you know, even in Tennessee here, we are seeing some things that are happening. And I think the question is, what could early care education do to address reparations, even its own systems? So I would say part of it is, how do we have these really tough conversations to really address it? And we can't do that if we don't recognize the foundation from which early care education started. And for me, I wanted to be able to see images of the Black women who took care of children. And that meant that their own children had to go somewhere. So for me, I would say that part of the 14 policies, that how do we correct some of those wrongs, even in our current day, but knowing that it's only the beginning. There's a lot of things that we do not talk about in the report that I think, you know, there's so much more we can add, but I hopefully it's a beginning for people to say, we have to talk about our workforce. We have to talk about our curriculum. We have to talk about our assessments, right? Like, you know, Stephanie's leading an assessment development around social cultural equity. She could talk about that, but we have to really look at the whole entire early care education program and systems, because they really are rife with a lot of inequities, a lot of white standards that in many ways does not privilege or even leverage, I would say, the cultural assets of Black people, of Indigenous people, and other minoritized populations. So we have some work to do, but I'm very hopeful that we are still in the conversation, right? By this, usually we're done with these kind of conversations in 6 months. So I'm very, very pleased that we are still, even for some people, they may not be happy, but we are still in these conversations. I think that's really, really important. So I just appreciate you, Jana. I appreciate you, Brian. I appreciate the whole high school community. And Alejandra, you know, the new president who came in, I think right before after I left. But I thank you all for continuing the conversation and continue to support our workforce in the way that you're doing to ensure that we engage in anti-bias, anti-racist education. And so thank you so much.
Thank you, Ioma. Before we get many of the questions that have been posed in the Q&A, actually you guys have addressed. There are some other questions that may have resulted from our conversation over the last couple of minutes. So Brian, any thoughts? This has been really a discussion, I think, that requires us to step forward with courage to kind of continue the conversation, Ioma. We're not going to stop.
Right. No, I agree with that. And, you know, I can't think of much that Ioma and Stephanie and Tanya haven't said so far. You know, I think, you know, my takeaways from this great conversation, we always never have enough time, but, you know, this idea of joy, really focusing on joy, on, you know, kind of pushing forward with joy and, you know, despite all the obstacles, keeping that at the center. And, you know, this idea that we can't, you know, I agree, Stephanie, we can't kind of narrow it down to what one thing are we going to do when we have a systemic problem, and we have a systemic problem that pervades so many different systems. You know, I was reading an article earlier about, you know, in Illinois, we've passed a law prohibiting suspensions and expulsions in pre-K, and it's made a difference, but, you know, the data still shows that there are things that we're missing because of how we support our workforce and train our workforce, the bias that's, you know, that's within, you know, within our systems, within our society. We still have inequity. The law itself wasn't it. The data collection itself wasn't it. We have to address the systems and why these things are happening, you know, across the state, across the country. You know, and then I think, you know, the last thing that I hear, you know, from all three of the authors is really urgency, and I agree. And I think, you know, this is, I'm glad we're still having this conversation. I appreciate being brought in to the last part of this formal conversation, but I hope it doesn't end. So I do think we have, you know, a workforce crisis that we need to address. It's not acceptable that we've built a workforce on this idea of primarily women of color living in poverty. That doesn't work. That shouldn't be acceptable to any of us. That doesn't, you know, we're seeing it doesn't work. We're seeing it doesn't work as childcare centers begin to close. And I think we, you know, now is the time, as we're starting to see more national attention to the childcare crisis, and at the same time we're seeing a lot of emphasis at the federal level on investing in early childhood. I think now is the time to really push urgency and to you know, to be bold in what comes next, and what comes next has to be a system that, you know, I think I heard you say, Jana, joyful and just. And I think that's got to be at the center of what comes next. So I won't ramble on more, but I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you, Brian. We actually don't have additional questions. There have been a number of comments, and I've heard you guys talk about hope, joy, persevering in the effort. I want to give the authors, Ioma just listed in the chat the equity report she was describing earlier. I want to give Stephanie and Tanya a last opportunity to kind of give us any final thoughts. Ioma has jumped off, and then I'm going to hand off to Alejandra to talk about the next steps that we'll be having with our next book study. So Tanya, I see you're unmuted, please.
I'm just encouraged, you know, that it was a reason that you all decided to join and listen to this webinar and engage in this webinar. And so I'm just encouraged and excited. And one of the things that I just want to stress is a part of what I try to do in this work is to live and operate in grace. So as I'm encountering racism, as I'm encountering isms, whether it's intentional or not, to first have grace, but then to speak my truth and also to share my experiences and what I observed of how it's impacting people who look like me and other Black and brown people, and then have an expectation. So first have grace, because when we know better, we then do better, and then have the expectation of, well, now you know, so what are you going to do about it? And so having that expectation and holding each other accountable for doing better.
I love that. I've added that to my list of words that have described this webinar. I would maybe add mercy as well. Stephanie.
I would like to say my main takeaway point is I love the joy and justice and joy. And I just feel like if I can keep that in the forefront of my mind as I'm guiding and doing all of my work, I think that we will get to sort of where we need to be in terms of dismantling this system that we have.
Thank you. Building back better as well, right? Okay, Alejandra, I'd like to bring you in a little bit early, remind everybody who's remained on the audience, thank you for sticking with us. All of the recordings are available on HighScope's YouTube channel. I think they're all worth going back. It's not always that a webinar is worth going back and looking at again, but I encourage folks to do so. I'm really thrilled at Alejandra's leadership of HighScope as the new president and her commitment. She was hired by the board because of her stated commitment toward equity and justice for young children. That is the beginning, the very beginnings of HighScope and with the Perry Preschool Project. So I know that she has the leadership to shoulder this endeavor going forward, and we all plan to hold hands and make good trouble as she does so. So Alejandra, thank you, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Jana. And I once again want to thank Stephanie, Tanya, Ioma, and Carrie Ann for allowing us to share your work and with us with these roundtables. We want to remind everyone that we will continue to sell your book on our website, and that, like Jana mentioned, the recordings are still available and will be kept there in our website, because it is a very important conversation, not only in the United States, but I know all over the world. Everyone wants to continue learning from your work. Thank you all for the research that you have done, because then we can all put it into practice, because that's really what it is all about. We want to thank you again. I know we will have within HighScope, we will start our roundtable experience with our next book, which will happen in August 18th. And it's a roundtable series on the book Segregation by Experience. And it is a book written by Jennifer Keyes-Adair and Kiyomi Sanchez-Colgrave. So please, for our participants, reach out to highscope.org and our roundtable to sign up for Segregation by Experience. And we want to continue this conversation. As Jana mentioned, it is because the HighScope Foundation was established, the Perry Preschool Study that started in Ypsilanti, Michigan, with our founder, Dr. Weichert, concerned with segregation that was occurring in the city of Ypsilanti in the school system. And that is where our HighScope curriculum and our approach, that is the foundation. This is a very important conversation for HighScope. We want to continue being the voice and offering a space for individuals in the United States and all over the world to come together with these conversations, these rich conversations that we have just experienced. So thank you again. They're asking about the cost of the book, and I know I'm reading the chat as we're also talking along, but we will put it in the chat and we will keep it on so that you can click on that button and go to purchase the book that we have for you. Thank you everyone for joining us. And here's the highscope.org where we will continue to provide the book for everyone.
Thank you all. Also, a thank you to Katie and to Ingrid for backroom management, so ably done.
You will receive the certificate of attendance, will be emailed to you. And once again, the recording will continue to be posted tomorrow on YouTube, High Scope Preschool.